seems spooky month is upon us, which would make it the perfect time to talk about Pacific Drive, created by Ironwood Studios and published by Kepler Interactive. It's a story-based survival game with a customizable vehicle that you use to explore through an abandoned region infested with paranormal phenomena. If we must use comparisons, its genre contemporaries are going to be games like Subnautica, Forever Skies, and so on. SCP fans will see some familiarity here, albeit in a more chill package. But before we can get to the game, obviously we have to talk about the menu, and it has quite an extensive list of features for audio and video options, as well as a lot of accessibility features for people who need that kind of thing. Under the Gameplay tab, they give you a large variety of changes that you can make for your gameplay experience and difficulty, as well as quality of life features. There's also been a recent update that adds a variety of new gameplay modes, including a hardcore mode where you only get one life. On the premise side of things, we have a fairly typical science gone wrong story with a little bit of a difference. Scientists discovered LIMP technology, and the Olympic Peninsula became a staging ground for experimentation. Unfortunately, as is often the case with this sort of thing, the paranormal stuff started to happen. When things got too out of control, the Olympic Exclusion Zone was created. It's a large area cordoned off by 3 circular walls, with a population of now 4 people. And this is where the player character comes in. You are the driver. Specifically, you are a driver, a delivery driver. And, well, you know how this goes. I don't think insurance is going to cover that one. And shortly after your little teleportation accident comes the car. My understanding is that the vehicle in the game is an amalgamation of various models of station wagons from around the 1980s or so.
Whoa, wait, hold the phone. There it is again, that blip on the spectrometer. I've seen that waveform before, but where? No kidding. Could it be? A remnant?
And, well, no car is complete without an auto shop, right? In this case, we have Oppie's Auto Shop. Oppie's Auto Shop is your primary base of operations. It's where you do a lot of your crafting, your tech progression, and it's where you embark from on your expeditions.
Who's there? God, the shop. God, it's been breaks.
You've got 5 seconds to get the hell out before I... Ow! My head.
Before we get too far into it, I really want to talk about the atmosphere. If you were to ask me to point to one aspect of this game that really stands out, I would ultimately say it's the atmosphere. Although Pacific Drive does have a stylized graphics set, it is a little bit more realistic in appearance. It's not photoreal, but it sort of manages to do both simultaneously in a way that's great. There are some areas where the graphics kind of slip in terms of some shoddy textures, but overall, it is actually pretty good-looking game. I also quite enjoyed the lighting. It is not particularly unique lighting as far as I'm aware, but it does do what it does quite well, and the developers were not afraid to have dark areas, especially like anomalously dark areas. They give you lights, they give you flashlights, they give you headlights, and various upgrades of those items, so you have options to deal with darkness when you need it. The ambient audio and the various weather effects also sound really good. The rain sounds really nice, and you also get a nice range of various spooky sound effects that play in the background sometimes. But I'm just going to let it play so that people can appreciate it. The atmosphere is great stuff, but let's talk about gameplay.
So you might as well start by fixing up that car. Just don't break anything in my shop with those soft hands of yours.
So the first thing on the agenda is, you got this rust bucket, you need to make some improvements to your garage, so you gotta go out and grab some resources to do it with.
This is the zone. Within these borders, all matter has lost the ability to hold a constant physical state. What that means is the shape, size, and makeup of just about everything constantly changes. A mile of grass can turn into 10 miles of swamp in the blink of an eye, and it does. Constantly. I advise you not to take the zone lightly. You better gear up or you may not survive the trip. Which would make my life easier, so your call.
The garage map essentially acts as a sort of level select screen. Each node represents a stable pocket of space in the anomaly zone. The garage has a radio antenna that you can upgrade over time to get more charges, and those charges are used to stabilize junctions that you can then travel to. And those routes are effectively levels that are sort of semi-randomized with prefab tiles and structures.
But you can't get back the way you came. The instability makes all routes one way. And that's where my arc device comes into play. It'll get you back to the garage, but it needs to be charged first.
This is where the anchor plugs come into play. They're what charge the arc device, and they also have some broader implications which will come into play later. Yummy.
The arc device is charged and ready. You'll use it to open a gateway back to the garage, but it will immediately collapse the stability around you. So only activate when you're absolutely ready to leave. You do not want to get caught in the storm that follows.
So when you're ready to return to the garage, and you've gathered enough anchor energy to charge your arc device, at that point you select one of the pre-positioned gateways on the level. They have a sort of minimum radius, so you have to be a certain distance away from them. The gateway turns into a giant beam of light, the map destabilizes, and you have to drive through it before the Battle Royale circle encloses upon you. As for why you do this, it's to get resources and do story missions.
Okay, newbie. I'll keep this simple. Don't want to overwhelm that little brain of yours. You'll need a few things to rebuild the antenna at the garage. First on the list is plasma. The woods are littered with plasma generators. Look for a research trailer or a spark tower. That's those antenna things zapping you when you get too close. Both are always accompanied by plasma generators.
The arc device is picking up on some plasma generators nearby. Your headset has a built-in scanner. Use it on the plasma generator, and it'll figure out the tools you need.
So pretty much right off of the bat, the first thing that you have to go do is commit large quantities of theft.
Looks like it's ripe for the picking.
At this point, I should probably mention the game is titled Pacific Drive. The studio's from Seattle. The place is called the Olympic Exclusion Zone. It's obviously based in the Pacific Northwest. Basically what that means is if you're from a place like, Eastern Washington, the Spokane area, this gameplay loop's going to feel really at home for you. It's basically just breaking and entering and stealing copper. So, yeah. They even call one of the anomaly types tourists. I'm going to try not to read too much into that. They even give you a special tool to steal parts off of derelict cars. Hell, even the locals are in on it now. Whatever happened to honor among thieves? Come on, guys. And of course, the acquisition of resources and the scanning of anomalies is all in service of the tech tree. Pacific Drive offers an extensive tech tree with a lot of tools, car parts, and base parts for you to unlock as you go along. Naturally, this includes things like better engines, but it also includes stuff like solar panels for an electric engine, so you can have an electric station wagon. Your tech progression is gated by the scanning of anomalies and the acquisition of anchor energy. Remember this little guy? Yeah, I said he'd come back. Well, I guess that's what the plug is for.
No, interesting. interesting thing about those anchor plugs, they use limb technology to stake down pockets of stability in an area. Basically, they delay how quickly you're turned into Swiss cheese out there.
In addition to what you find opening random containers, there's also a variety of very special resources that are generated as anomalies themselves. Each one has a tool associated with it. It's very important to use the correct tool. In total, there are 5 tools that you use for resource gathering. The first is the pry bar, the second is the cutting saw, which I'm using incorrectly here. The third is the impact hammer I'm meant to be using here, a hand vacuum, and then the liberator, which is what you saw me use earlier to cut those parts off that vehicle. A couple of the anomalous resources also have specific mechanics associated with them that govern how you're supposed to collect them. Really nice of the developers to plant that light there as your hint. In this case with the swamp coral, as you can see, having the light prevents the little pinky bits from going back into the coral. Later on, you get an upgraded variant of the vacuum that has a light attached to it so that when you're vacuuming, it projects the light that prevents them from receding. When it comes to the various man-made resources you salvage from like existing artist sites and vehicles, you can get quickly overwhelmed by collecting too much of them, but with anomalous resources, you always need more. Unfortunately, most of the anomalous resources are more or less just hit hammer with rock. Only a few of them actually do have special mechanics. Having said that, it's important to make sure that as you're getting into the end game, you are providing yourself with upgraded versions of the various tools so that you aren't doing stuff like this. Well, at least I'm using the right tool this time. So now that you've gone out and you've acquired all these resources, you can start to replace all these crusty and rusty old panels with something that looks quite a lot nicer. And it's at this point that the station wagon really starts to shine through. Pushing into more of the mid-game, the late game, this is when you start to sort of run into a little bit of trouble. You start getting access to parts that are very non-automobile. And this makes for a good time to segue into personalization. You're given a large variety of different paints and stickers to customize the look of your car, as well as some options for like different steering wheels and bobbleheads. So here you can see this mesh part, that's for electrical resistance. Some of the stuff doesn't really look as good in my opinion. This is my car all decked out in armored panels, and then the back there you've got some other resistance panels. And it's just kind of whatever. Some of the paints and stickers also don't really apply well to these, so that's kind of another demerit there. On top of that, I'll get into this a little bit later, but it's not really necessary, to be honest. Speaking of damage resistances, that's a good time to segue into anomalies. Pacific Drive does feature a fairly extensive list of various anomalies to encounter. However, in this we kind of run into the caveat. In the same way that other games often suffer from having reskinned enemies, we kind of have a bit of a reskinned anomalies problem. When I talked about damage types before, this is where that fits in. A large number of these are various AoE effects with different damage types. Even the unique anomalies often have various damage type forms as well, like electrical tourists or healing bunnies. Just here alone we have the spike puddle, and then we have the electrical cloud, the radiation field. And then once you start getting into the mid-zone, you start seeing a lot of poison stuff. And you've got like poison artillery balls coming at you, and bunnies flying everywhere, and poison clouds, and poison clouds, and poison clouds. If it wasn't obvious, there is more of a quality over quantity sort of approach when it comes to the game's difficulty via anomalies. On the topic of bunnies, they are my favorite anomaly. They are sort of a creature that's coalesced into scrap parts. They come in a lot of varieties. Some of them are meant to troll you or hurt you, and some of them can actually help you too. A lot of the time they're just a bunch of assholes. Another kind of useful anomaly is the service stop, which comes in a variety of different forms, like ones that will charge your electricity, reheal your car, But there are also other sorts of helpful anomalies. There are also anomalies that are more like traps. This one was the bane of my existence in particular because the wriggling wreck is required to be scanned in order to unlock battery tech, which I did not have for a long time. And then as you get more towards the late game, things get a little bit more grandiose. And of course, we can't not talk about the little mannequin boys. The tourists are one of the earlier anomalies that you encounter, and they're, I would assume, probably one of the fan favorites along with the bunnies, since they have a little bit more of a unique flair to them. They are essentially the, if you don't look at them, they move anomaly. Naturally, as a result of this behavior, they do get in a little bit of hijinks sometimes. And in typical tourist fashion, they really like cues. And they blow up if you throw stuff at them. So at this point, you've heard me kind of lay in a couple of criticisms here and there about the game difficulty and anomalies, and this is footage of me dying the only time in my entire playthrough. The cause of death here is fairly simple. The map that I'm on has an effect that causes the sort of like corrosive damage that I'm encountering right now in that little AoE field there to sap out my fuel, and I parked next to that little totem there that heals my vehicle, not realizing that there was the AoE field there, and it sucked out all my fuel, and then I died from radiation poisoning in an unstable map as I was trying to escape from it. So that was my fault, technically speaking.
Look, I'm sorry. I gotta know. What does it feel like when the car magically zaps you back to the garage? That's gotta be wild.
So yeah, at least in my experience, the difficulty was definitely not great. It feels like the game really relies on throwing a lot of anomalies at you at the same time, and frankly speaking, I'm not even sure how much it's intended for people to die when they're playing this game. It does feel like a little bit more of a casual experience. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I would have liked to have seen a better variety of anomalies that have a more direct and impactful effect rather than you just kind of skirting around things and running away from stuff. I did play on release, and I know there has been some updates since then, but in my opinion, it's more of a fundamental problem with the anomalies. I did get blindsided by anomalies every now and then, but at most I would take some pretty significant vehicle damage, and I would spend 30 minutes in the garage repairing it. But for the most part, a lot of these anomalies are really just static, so you can just kind of go around them, and they have very obvious telegraphs as to where they are and what they affect. To make matters worse, later on, they kind of give you a shield as part of the story that really just trades battery power for everything being irrelevant. And because of the genre proximity, I can't help but think about Subnautica as I'm playing through this game. Subnautica 2 is a very atmospheric game, but it has very sparse threats, and those threats are highly threatening, but they're also set up in the world as progression blockers to help gate players from getting into new territories and progressing the story. Whereas with Pacific Drive, it just seems like it sort of randomly spawns anomalies based off of whatever the map's criteria is set to. Like I said before, though, I don't know if I would necessarily call this a bad thing. In the end, I felt like this game was a little bit more Death Stranding than Subnautica. Which is to say, I felt like the goal of the game was a little bit more based around the atmosphere and the travel experience as opposed to intending for you to run around and shoot ghosts and beat people up. Although often unchallenging, many of the anomalies are actually pretty cool to look at, and they are very interesting. And sometimes they're kind of scary in a way that is not directly impactful to you. And the bunnies and the tourists are kind of cool in their own way. So if the idea of traveling around this exclusion zone full of all these weird anomalies and upgrading your strange anomaly car and learning about the story and experiencing all of these interesting happenstances is something that appeals to you, then this game might be your poison. Did I say anomaly car, by the way? Yeah, it's probably a good time to talk about that. Just for the record, I'm not doing that. The car's haunted. So as you're traveling around, the car starts to sort of develop these quirks. And these quirks are, as you can see from this list here, a variety of relationships between various parts and functions that, as far as I'm aware, are probably randomly generated. So in this case, it manifests as when I back the car up, the hood opens, You go into the garage, use this computer terminal, and you kind of guess which ones are which. You might need to play around with the car and figure out what exactly is going on, and then you use some repair parts to fix it, and you're good to go. The quirks are an interesting aspect of the game, and it adds just that little bit more character to it, but it's also one of my chief criticisms, too. That criticism largely being that I would have liked to have seen more of it. From a story perspective, the vehicle is a sort of a remnant. It's an object that binds itself to a person, and it has, a weird property to it. It's an anomaly. And from a story perspective, there are only 3 characters, not including the main character who's the voiceless protagonist. And so I felt like there was an opportunity for the car to be a more present character in the story, and quirks are a way that potentially could have manifested itself as more of a character. There's also one additional weird thing. On the left side of the dash, there's that little green monitor, and there can also be like a Tamagotchi game sort of thing, where you feed the car, it's a thing. And so I'm not sure what that was for or what it was meant to do, but you kind of hopefully see the issue that I have here, where it feels like the car was destined to be something greater and just sort of didn't get to have that moment. And that makes me a little sad.
Hey, driver, I bet you're dying to hear all about the remnants by now.
Can you not? I'm a little busy trying to keep them alive.
Well, that about covers more or less all the things that I have to say about the gameplay. In the end, I do find it an enjoyable game, and it does have some really interesting aspects to it. According to the Ironwood Studios website, many of their developers worked on some pretty recognizable game titles in the past, but they do consider this their debut. Without getting too presumptuous, my impression is that they worked within their means as a new studio and kept the scope a little bit more limited, and it came out fine, but I really would have liked to have seen more Pacific Drive. All of that having been said, the last thing to talk about is the story, and I'm inclined to keep that a little bit more on the brief side because there's not actually too much to the story. In terms of overall length, it is fairly short, and it is delivered pretty much entirely in narrative form via various radio messages that you hear from the other 3 characters. So, spoiler time.
I'll start from the beginning. In 1964, strange objects began appearing throughout the zone. They were shabby, cast-off things that were imbued with strange properties. A broken microwave that froze food instead of warming it. A rusty can of paint that produced every color in existence. Always so out of place that people were irresistibly drawn to them.
Yeah, like a mysterious car in the forest, right?
These obsessions always started innocently. A sudden interest in model train sets or collecting old road signs.
The objects themselves would exhibit anomalous properties, but what didn't in the zone, right? That in itself wasn't cause for alarm. But these fixations would only grow worse until its victims could think of nothing else but the remnant. And they always ended with spiraling into madness and disappearing in a mad chase after something.
Sorry, driver, it doesn't sound fun, but better to know what you're up against.
So if you're a big fan of SCP and other sorts of similar kinds of stories, this should be pretty familiar. We've been getting to see a lot more paranormal science fiction sorts of stories in the same vein as SCP a lot over the last 10 years, and it's been really nice to see because it's really interesting stuff. And there have been some pretty great games using these kinds of ideas, like Lobotomy Corporation. Control comes to mind especially. They even have a term, objects of power, to describe these sorts of artifacts, these remnants. Lethal Company has a lot of references to various SCP entries. Even Death Stranding, which I mentioned earlier, has a lot of paranormal stuff in it and some very science fiction sort of approaches to them. And now here in Pacific Drive, we have the remnants, and the remnants are paranormal objects that do a bunch of otherworldly things, and they tie themselves to users, and those users are compelled to do things, and they are eventually killed as a result. This means that for the player, the goal of the story is to sever the link between themselves and the remnant. And, well, that means it's science time.
Car's still not close enough to Cappy.
What now?
How about,
Launching the car into Cappy's core.
I'm sorry. What?
Well, but if it's the only way. Yeah, you got this, kid, for it.
Oh, you don't have to tell me twice.
Oppie? Anytime now, Oppie!
And Cappy amplified the car signal and it matches. Looks like Tobias and Francis found their remnant after all.
So step one, the scientific method, is that you have to determine that the car is indeed a remnant, which it is. That brings you to the second major prong of the story, which is the mass hallucination event.
This hallucination wave that triggered, we picked up its waveform. And it turns out it's equal and opposite to the remnant's waveform. They're paired signals. It means they're related. And what's more, if we bring that car to whatever this mass hallucination source is, we have a chance of nullifying the remnant and breaking its bond with the driver. A simple destructive interference.
This is insane! After all this time, we find a remnant, lean on the mass hallucinations of 61, and a possible way to free the driver? Pinch me, Francis, because this is the best thing that's happened in decades. Just when things were getting dull.
The remnants. It was a key to the mass hallucination. This whole time.
Yes, and you nearly destroyed it.
I need to go.
This is huge, Francis! We have so much work to do.
I know, I've already pulled every report on the mass hallucination event. Driver, listen, you stay safe out there. We'll report back to you once we've gone through all of this data. There's a lot of it. And
Be careful. Oppie's not in her right mind, okay? So, watch yourself.
If it wasn't clear, Francis is a bit of a dick. Anyways, they believe the anomaly is the key to discovering what the mass hallucination event was.
It's my turn to give you an explanation about the mass hallucination event that Tobias and Francis were going on about. But don't worry, I won't be nearly as long-winded, because there honestly isn't much that we know about it. It happened on the morning of September 14th, 1961. My colleague, Dr. James Kay, was conducting experiments at a highly classified site in the Deep Zone. He was assisted by my husband, Dr. Alan Turner. At 0400, their experiment unleashed a gamma-ray surge that instantly killed both of them. The surge was an impossible amount of energy, orders of magnitude greater than any man-made source. It also triggered hallucinations in anyone awake within a 10-mile radius. It was a burst of widespread insanity, but only for a short moment.
Oh, whoa, buddy, I'm parking here. What the hell? You seeing this? Electric balls these days. So the mass hallucination was a fairly substantial event in the lore of this world. It seemed to be some pretty major chaotic event that affected a pretty wide spread of people, and it originated from the anomaly zone and resulted in the deaths of some people who were pretty important. The rest of the story is basically revolved around connecting the dots on these two things and figuring out what exactly the mass hallucination event was, while also severing the tie between the driver and the remnant car. But if I go into any more here, like I said, there's not that much story content overall, so anything more starts to get some pretty spoilery territory. I will say that the voice acting in the game is pretty good. Tobias is especially funny because he's kind of a Bigfoot enthusiast, which in the context of this game story is pretty hilarious. If it wasn't clear though, not really a fan of Francis as a character. All that having been said, there's one last thing that I do need to talk about, and it's the story missions and how they work. It's going to be brief, but it's going to be pretty clear, I think. What you're seeing right now with me driving through these little electrical things and hitting these nodes, you do this multiple times. Remember earlier when we got to pilot the car into the giant weird anomaly thing and people got upset because, oh, you're going to destroy the remnant? That's arguably the most interesting thing that happens in all of the story missions. So, yeah. In total, I recorded about an hour and a half or so worth of story content, most of which is just me running around and doing stuff while I get radio messages explaining the story, which as far as delivery mechanisms is fine, but again, it does leave one feeling a little wanting. But anyways, that is the last thing I have to say. But yeah, that's Pacific Drive. It's an interesting game. It's chill, it's fun, it's got paranormal stuff in it, and if any of this seems appealing, I definitely recommend picking it up. Especially probably now or soon. It's October after all, and well, it's kind of a horror game, so you know what happens. Daddy Gaben's wild ride continues.